I've said before that on these early episodes, nearly every host was chosen to demonstrate the value of the show to a certain audience or demographic. Reiner got primetime TV folks watching, Tomlin and Pryor appealed to the comedy vanguard, and the Simon and Garfunkel reunion certainly got the attention of that group's fans. This week's installment, then, was meant to appeal to a group for which Lauren felt a particular affinity. Fans of the type of British humor becoming increasingly popular in the States with the recent arrival of Monty Python on PBS stations and in American theaters. To be clear, neither Peter Cook nor Dudley Moore were members of Python, although Cook would make some honorary appearances with them later in life. But they were seen as important progenitors of the typical Python style of humor. Lauren would eventually get his Python host in Eric Idle for season 2, but I suppose Cook and Moore's appearance can be seen as sort of an early entreaty to Anglophiles and an acknowledgement of the increasing influence of British comedy on American audiences. I was unfamiliar with hosts Peter Cook and Dudley Moore before I began researching this episode, and I have to say I'm going to have trouble doing justice to their nuanced personal relationship and troubled professional collaboration within the scope of this short video. There have been entire books and movies written about these two, and I recommend the biopic Not Only But Always as a primer if your interest is piqued. It takes a few liberties, as most biopics do, but is quite well done and is available streaming in low quality here on YouTube. To give you the Crib Notes version, Peter and Dudley began working together in a stage revue Cook created called Beyond the Fringe, an important outfit in the formation of the early British comedic satire scene. When Dudley, an accomplished entertainer and pianist in his own right, was offered his own BBC series in 1965, he invited Peter to appear with him, leading to their wildly successful and influential series Not Only But Also, which ran until about 1970. They also made movies during this period and embarked on a tour of Australia and a run of Broadway shows ending in 1975. During the run on Broadway, the two bored entertainers booked a recording studio and ad-libbed a bunch of raunchy, expletive-filled monologues as alter egos they dubbed Derek and Clive, with no real intent to ever release them to the public, just as a laugh. However, the recording engineer, unbeknownst to the duo, distributed bootlegs of the tapes around the entertainment world, which reportedly made it into the hands of the Rolling Stones and other industry insiders, including folks in SNL's orbit. I suspect these filthy and illicit bootlegs might have contributed some credibility towards getting them on the show, but that's supposition on my part. Regardless of how or why they got there, I suspect it was not a happy appearance for any of those involved. By this point, Cook and Moore's relationship had deteriorated badly. Cook was a problem drinker and could be quite jealous of Moore's easy manner with ladies and his greater movie-making successes. I don't like trying to distill what was a complicated and fraught relationship into such a simple summary, but they'd fallen out of love with each other by this point. There's a great Michael Parkinson interview with the two of them from around this time where Moore describes their relationship as a marriage. Parkinson asks how so, to which Cook deadpans, "We're getting divorced." The other two laugh at this, but Cook just kind of grins knowingly. This would be one of the very last times the two performed together, certainly the last time widely seen on TV. Neil Sedaka initially seemed to me one of the stranger choices for a music guest so far, as I thought of him primarily as a songwriter from the 60s. It turns out, though, that he was having a bit of a career resurgence in the mid-70s with the likes of hit album Sedaka's Back and the #1 song of 1975, a recording of his track Love Will Keep Us Together by Captain and Tennille. Here, he performs his ballad remake of Breaking Up Is Hard to Do. He begins the song by listening to the original 1962 girl group version on a handheld radio, a reference likely lost on the audience, and Lonely Nights from his album Overnight Success. This is some Melanin Challenge shit if I've ever heard, but Sedaka's a technically accomplished songwriter, and I can't hate the odd chord progressions and crazy key changes. He obviously knows his way around pop music confectionery, and I've got no complaints about that part. What's really off-putting, even creepy, is Neil's stilted and strange stage persona. He has the dead eyes of a Vegas wax museum doll, and he just seems a little off, mugging straight into the camera as he croons these rather depressing yet bizarrely upbeat songs about love and loss. He strikes me, both as a songwriter and a performer, maybe even as a human being, as someone who goes about the endeavor very mechanically and without feeling, like a robot.
Insert 13% more melodrama and change to diminished chord. Execute 20 go to 10. Smirk, wink at camera.
He traffics in manufactured emotions, and it obviously worked for him on the easy listening charts. I just don't think it translates to a live performance on SNL very well. We get a little more daring with the anal beads joke they started last week. They were really enjoying these "the censors won't get it" jokes, but I sometimes wonder how much of the audience got them as well. I mean, this was pre-internet, so how many folks really even knew what beads, for instance, were for? I guess that was part of the cool kid exclusivity of the show. This week in current events, General Franco has now been critically dead for 8 weeks. We had a joke about Ford considering a black man as his running mate.
As a token of his appreciation.
A joke about the Concorde's maiden flight. That's quite a thing to consider, seeing as how it's now long retired. There's a good Chevy break at the beginning of this one as well, an example of him being more funny when he screws up.
Great Britain,
And finally, following reports of dangerous killer bees at the southern border, we have a warning of apartment-eating cattle crossing the northern border. We're still trying and failing to call Angola. This week we get Angela's roommate, and a callback to the beads joke. Lorraine interviews folks in Times Square about abortion. This was a little surprising to see on air in the 70s. Not surprisingly, Garrett hasn't had one.
Have you ever had an abortion?
Nah, I haven't.
Emily Latella's editorial reply this week is about Soviet jewelry as opposed to Jewry. This is more like it. The zany pun works better than some of the earlier tries. The best joke of the update is Chevy's hurried combination of the two final stories, wherein boxer George Foreman knocked out the capital city of Beirut, Lebanon following warfare in that Mediterranean prize fight. Zweibel does the repeat of the top story from the shower as news for the wet. Good one for this week. Gary Weiss has the lone film this week now that Albert Brooks' contract is finished. He interviews some lady who runs a warehouse full of gag gifts
Oh my goodness.
and practical joke props. She explains all of them in excruciating detail, thereby immediately making them unfunny. I'm unsure whether this is high concept or just boring. Seriously, listening to somebody try to explain why a mug with a bad Polish joke on it is funny is not funny at all. Does she really have to spend this long extolling the many uses of fake plastic roaches to us? And why can't she seem to come up with anything other than put them in salads? I find it suspicious, by the way, how whoever's introducing the film of the week always goes out of their way to tell you how great it is before it starts, really hype it up. Last week it was Buck Henry, this week poor Jane tries their best to convince us, but I mean, statistically, she's probably lying. Most of these are just not very good.
It's terrific.
This time it's just Gilda talking to one of them, an improvement, I guess. He auditions for Weekend Update.
Well, I could do news update. I'm capable.
Okay.
Good evening. I'm Scred, and you're not.
This is the least awful effing Muppets so far, except for the bit with Scred getting all skeezy and handsy with Gilda. Scred also gets the dubious honor of introducing Sedaka's second song, so good for him, I guess. I wonder if Neil had any thoughts on being introduced by felt, to paraphrase Mike O'Donoghue. The Muppets work better like this, as a part of the show's world, rather than when they try to make them exist in the land of Gorch, in my opinion.
Nothing to worry about. Somebody from the bomb squad will be here in a second.
A cute premise without much in the way of execution. The audience is suitably amused, but it turns out to be all set up. The intended payoff is flubbed when the hand coming out of the bomb box misses Chevy's face, merely smearing a bit of banana cream across his nose. They attempt to rectify this oversight and get it done properly later in the show, which winds up being far funnier anyway.
Live from New York, it's Saturday night!
I normally discuss the monologue when I talk about the host, but this bit really stands out as more of a sketch in and of itself, so I thought I'd put it here. Cook and Moore come out to some light banter, and then they set about demonstrating sophisticated British humor, with an evergreen sketch of Cook's from way back in the early 60s, wherein Moore hops around on one leg as an amputee whilst auditioning for the role of Tarzan. Sophisticated indeed. It's actually quite a wonderful bit, quintessentially British in its silly premise given a straight reading, and a perfect introduction to the duo for those unfamiliar with their style. I'm sure they could do this piece in their sleep by this point, but their timing and delivery are utterly impeccable, and I adore this one. In which the players try to convince Cook, playing a famous film director, to cast them in a prison play. Aykroyd kills Bugs, Chevy acts like a creepy child rapist, then lunges at Gilda. Belushi does That's Life as a sleazeball lounge singer, then lunges at Cook. And Garrett sings his famous Kill All the Whiteys song and also lunges at Gilda. There's a lot of lunging going on in this one, frankly. Garrett wins this sketch hands down. I can see why clips from this one frequently made anniversary shows and the like. It's just plain entertaining in how hard it tries to offend proper sensibilities. Incidentally, George Coe makes a rare appearance outside of pre-taped material here. This is pure supposition, but I can't help but wonder if Coe's role had originally been intended for more, but was recast to avoid the two leads having to spend time rehearsing together. As discussed, Pete and Dud's relationship had already gotten pretty frayed by this point, and I suspect they probably weren't keen on or even able to perform anything as a pair that would require extended read-throughs for the duo. In which Gilda and Danny get in an elevator in a lobby and are told they can exit the elevator into a different country for a vacation. This is a pretty dopey idea for a skit, and the gag is entirely Dudley Moore standing in front of various backgrounds and quickly changing outfits so it'll look like every floor is a different country when they open the elevator door. Not groundbreaking stuff, but cute enough. It's another sketch with the players, and one but not both of the hosts, somewhat bearing out my earlier point about them maybe not wanting to spend more time together than necessary. Cook and Moore do an extraordinarily British talk show interview. Cook is playing his character Sir Arthur Strebe Greebling, or Grebe Streebling, depending on Cook's mood at the moment, a stereotypical upper-class English lord. Cook himself came from a privileged background, and it's thought Sir Arthur was at least somewhat autobiographical. I'm in love with Peter Cook's various accents, which are entertaining whether or not the material is uproariously funny. I think it's easy for Americans not to notice how excellent both of these men are with dialect. British all sounding vaguely the same to us, but Cook especially has a gift for matching voice to character. Think about it, how many American actors do you know who are equally comfortable doing a Bronx accent and a Tennessee Hill Country accent? A middle-class Minnesotan and a Texan oil guy? Peter Cook can go Cockney to Queen's English in a microsecond, and I find it fascinating. This sketch doesn't play well to SNL's studio audience, however. I get the feeling much of the wordplay is lost on them, and the character probably seems more cartoonish than satirical. They at least giggle at his silly leg crossing, the Philistines. I enjoyed it greatly, regardless of the fact it's titled Table Talk, yet features no table. I guess maybe it got in the way of the leg crossing. Good God. Sweet, merciful, plaid fancy pants. Cook and Moore do a skit as the Scottish Sonny and Cher, and it's an utter affront to comedy and to humanity. Not gonna lie, I didn't make it all the way through this one. It ruined not only this episode the first time I watched it, but my entire mental state for the rest of the day afterwards. It's one of the single worst things I've ever seen, not just in researching for this show, but in my whole life. I'm actually gonna whip up a graphic here, something I can't often be bothered to do. They're always making Jane a talk show host. In this one, she interviews Belushi, who's a male impersonator named Sheila. They've already done similar interview shows based around Pryor and Bergen using race-changing makeup, etc., and this concept is similarly slightly uncomfortable in 2021. The tone here isn't disrespectful or anything, it just comes off kinda tone-deaf these days. I didn't find it terribly amusing either, but Belushi's good with what he's given. A commercial where Chevy and his lady, portrayed by real-life girlfriend Jacqueline Carlin, have a lovely day out at the park with the tagline, "Neither of these people used any commercial product to make themselves more attractive to each other." That's the gag, and I kinda like it. Take that, roll-on deodorant ads. In which Moore plays a surgeon who, before extracting an expired patient's heart for transplant, asks for a show of hands from his team as to their agreement that the patient cannot be resuscitated. They unanimously raise their hands, with the only dissent coming from patient Garrett, who weakly raises his arm in protest. Scene. Again, they aren't really making much of an effort for poor Garrett here. I suppose nearly dead guy is better than nothing, but not by much. Matthew, of the Biblical New Testament, is a newspaper reporter for the Bethlehem Star who interviews a shepherd named Arthur about Jesus' birth. The crowd is polite, but I get the feeling these skits played better for Cook and Moore in Britain. I can see some of the difference between American and British comedy Cook spoke of earlier here. Most of the jokes in this piece are plays on biblical words and phrases, extremely linguistic sort of stuff. They make a punchline out of the phrase abiding in the fields, for instance, just a weird bit of King James verbiage they're riffing on, and it's funny to me, but it's subtle. Sketches like this require a good bit of investment and attention on the part of the audience, and I'm not sure they got it here, at least not from the studio audience. Maybe folks at home appreciated it more, but the live crowd doesn't seem to respond with guffaws so much as polite giggles. Cook and Moore's skits are longer, too, compared to the cast's, which probably doesn't help. Like much of the episode, I like the sketch more and more with repeated viewings. I told you we'd get a second shot at getting the cold open, right?
For those of you who missed the front of the show, we'd like to reconstruct it for you correctly.
This is a bomb.
Right.
Bomb.
Bomb.
That seems to work better. Chevy later hits Cook with some of the remnants, and Cook chases him around with scissors and threatens to cut off Chevy's dick. That would have made for some compelling live TV, certainly. Personally, this is the first time in researching for this series of videos that I've come across a new artist I'm actually excited to continue learning more about, as well as the first time I've been emotionally affected by what I've learned. Peter Cook and Dudley Moore's incredibly close yet ultimately toxic and untenable friendship and working partnership reminded me of some regrettably handled relationships in my own life. Learning about them has led to some reflection on the role my own past problem drinking might have played, and for that I'm thankful. I look forward to digging up more performances of their older teens just to spend more time with Pete and Doug, and I hope maybe this video will get you interested in them as well. Over the next few years, Cook and Moore would record a few more Derek and Clive records together, but otherwise ceased performing as a duo. Dudley Moore could simply no longer tolerate working with Cook, who had become increasingly abusive due in parts to jealousy over Moore's film success and to Cook's reliance on alcohol. Moore went on to appear with Chevy Chase in 1978's Foul Play and to host SNL again in 1986 on the strength of Hollywood hits such as Arthur and its sequel. Peter Cook, however, worked less frequently in the years after he and Moore split. I do not wish to join the chorus of critics who've said his talent was wasted or that drink took from him a greater life than that which he lived. As Stephen Fry put it, and I'm paraphrasing lightly, if one thing upset Peter, it was the idea that somewhere somebody might feel sorry for him. He was not an ambitious man, not concerned with being a star. His ego was not great. He was without worldly vanity. I watched with some distress remarks on the TV at his passing regarding flawed genius and unrealized potential, and thought, what silly, ignorant nonsense. What does that mean? That his potential would have been better realized by appearing in more Hollywood films? Now, I certainly agree with Fry here. A successful and long career isn't the measure of a man's accomplishment. I'd only add that, speaking for myself anyway, we simply wish we'd gotten more of this amazingly talented person than we did. I never knew who Peter Cook was before this week, but I wish now that there was more of his art and humor left behind than what he left us. Next week's episode is hosted by Dick Cavett, a perfectly average host who I can assure you is in no danger of awakening any sort of deep and meaningful revelations in me, just in case this week's slightly more personal and reflective tone didn't do it for you. Stay tuned!